Good day and welcome to this sub-module on ecosystem-based adaptation and mitigation in the context of coastal and marine ecosystems. My name is Herman Timmermans, formerly project manager of the Pacific Ecosystem-Based Adaptation to Climate Change, or PBAC project at SPREP. And I would encourage you to visit the PBAC legacy page, which is still up under www.sprep.org/PBAC. And there you'll find some really good technical resources, including a video of the project and the work that was done under that particular project. This PowerPoint presentation really starts off looking at coastal marine ecosystems, what they are, what the services they provide to us, and the threats that they are under, and why ecosystem-based adaptation is important and a useful and strategic climate adaptation approach. We'll look at three options: establishment of marine protected areas, restoration of coral reefs, restoration of mangroves, and there'll also be a summary of the key principles, challenges, and actions in doing this work in the context of coastal and marine actions. I should just point out at this stage that I have provided a bibliography which contains a number of references to resources. I've also provided a folder with those resources. A lot of them are very practical, a lot of them are guides. So I encourage you to look at those for further information on what's presented here in the slides. So coastal marine ecosystems, what are they? Well, there are a number of them. Coastal zone is a very dynamic area, given that it's where these two mediums, water and land, meet each other. It's really an interface transition zone. As a result, you get a number of ecosystems occurring in this very unique kind of interface zone. So we have coastal wetlands, which can be saltwater marshes, estuaries, lagoons, mangrove swamps, all familiar with seagrasses, seagrass meadows, coral reefs, sand dunes and sandy beaches, rocky shores, and we even have seamounts, which are more oceanic ecosystems, which are essentially underwater volcanoes that rise up from the bottom of the ocean at very deep depths and come up to shallow areas, and they tend to push nutrients that come along with the currents, and they hit these seamounts, they get pushed upwards, and you find a lot of fish and marine organisms gather there, act very much like fish aggregating devices in a sense. And if any of you are fishers, then you'll know that these are very good places to fish due to the rich biodiversity that's found there. Alright, so let's start looking at some of the climate change resilience benefits of services that are derived from coastal and marine ecosystems. These can both be direct and indirect. With regard to direct services, it's becoming increasingly realized and understood that coral reefs, seagrass, mangroves, and even coastal vegetation have a really important role to play in terms of attenuating wave energy, which means reducing the energy of the waves, thereby protecting shorelines during storm events, which, as we know, are becoming more frequent and are projected to become even more frequent with climate change. So the role of these ecosystems in this regard is becoming more important at the same time, and they're able to offer these services largely because of their structure. In the case of coral reefs, the physical structure, as the water passes over the coral reef, it forms a drag, so that slows down the water through friction. And in the case of mangroves, the highly diverse structural roots and branches, they provide a physical buffer, I guess, and serve to spread the wave energy out, thereby dissipating it and attenuating it. Seagrass also has a role, does the same kind of thing, maybe not as significantly, Coastal vegetation, of course, also helps in keeping the coastal sand, the beaches, intact. Mangrove swamps, those of you who have boats, you know that during cyclones, probably the best place to park your boat to keep it safe is in a mangrove, because of the shelter that it provides from strong winds and waves. Rocky shores, sand dunes and sandy beaches, they all buffer the land, being at the interface of the land and the sea, and they provide this buffer against storm surges and extreme high tides. Alright, let's look at some of the indirect climate change resilience services benefits derived from coastal marine ecosystems. So these really relate to supporting people's livelihoods, which in turn supports their health, their nutrition, their well-being, making them more resilient to disturbances, to changes in the environment that can be brought about through climate change. We think of the recent pandemic, the health threats that are always there, and that some of these health-related threats are likely to increase with climate change. If you look at dengue fever and malaria, etc. So the public health and the nutrition and well-being of our populations is really important to their climate change resilience. So to the economies of our countries, and many of these ecosystems, as you know, contribute significantly to our local and national economies. They do this through the provision of these ecosystem services, and by way of example, we have provisioning services. I guess the most important one in the context of the Pacific Islands is the provision of fish, which is the main source of protein for most people in most countries in the region. Seafood, similarly, and not only source of food but also a source of livelihood, as well as a great contributor to export earnings within these countries. So fish and seafood are probably the most important on the list from a socioeconomic point of view. They also provide construction materials. Think of mangroves providing wood for building, gravel and sand for building, etc. Fuel, again, mangrove wood is often used for cooking fires and other purposes. They also provide the basis for tourism. Many of the tourists that come to Fiji, they come because of the high quality of the marine and coastal ecosystems. They want to dive on coral reefs that are in a healthy condition. They want to have good-looking beaches. Want to have clean water, etc. So and tourism, as we all know, is a really big income earner in the region. So these are all provisioning services that these ecosystems provide, and at the same time, by supporting local people and the economy, they provide socioeconomic resilience in an indirect way. They also provide regulating services such as flood control, in the case of estuaries, which act as sponges, if you like, to attenuate the flood waters that come down through flash floods, for example, protecting people on the coast from those flood waters. They have a role to play in climate regulation. Mangroves, we know, are really, really efficient in terms of carbon sequestration. They do so at a higher rate than native forest trees in tropical forests. Some people say it's up to 10 times more efficient. So they're particularly efficient at doing that. And they store this carbon, they process it and they sequester it, and then it gets stored in the peat and the sediment that below their roots. And over time this builds up. So a lot of carbon is stored in these peats and these swampy areas under the mangroves. And of course they regulate the climate by other ways as well, such as the the general hydrological cycle, which I guess is part of support services, the next one, through evapotranspiration that occurs, and also the ocean itself is part of the hydrological cycle. And they play a role in recycling and cycling nutrients within the food web and within ecosystems. And they also support primary production of our various resources that we derive from these ecosystems. So unfortunately, these ecosystems are under threat. We have a lot of coastal development taking place in our islands. I think it's more than 70 or 80% of the population lives within 5 kilometers of the coast, excluding Papua New Guinea. So there's a tremendous amount of human pressure on our coastal and marine ecosystems. This slide really in the top right hand corner tries to show some of the climate change threats that these ecosystems are exposed to. Sea level rise being one of the main ones, I guess. And we also have increasing storm surges. We have extreme events like cyclones. We have the warming of the ocean, and as a result of the ocean absorbing more carbon, and as a result of that warming, a lot of corals are not able to survive. So that's a particularly serious threat to the future of corals, which is not looking very good. And we also have ocean acidification, which is also a result of the ocean absorbing a lot of carbon from the atmosphere and becoming more acidic, leading to the actual dissolving of all marine organisms that have calcium carbonate shells or skeletons or parts of their physiological makeup. Corals included, but also oysters and mussels and shellfish. These are some of the main threats from climate change, but then more immediately, I guess, we have anthropogenic threats which stem from human activities, development related. These range from coastal developments and the waste that's being generated by the amount of people that are living, particularly when we have high-rise kind of buildings and resorts that are going up close to the coast. Some of that sewage and waste ends up getting into the coastal waters if it's not properly controlled and managed. We have issues with mining and logging. Here you see the forest being cut down, you see the soil erosion happening as a result of that, and we see the mudslide and a lot of sediment entering into the coastal system. Corals in particular are very susceptible to high levels of sedimentation, and if you have too much of it, they start to die, and you find they can actually change state into a coral-dominated ecosystem to one that's dominated by algae. Algae tends to do well in these kinds of conditions, but an algae-dominated coral ecosystem does not support much biodiversity as compared to a coral reef ecosystem. So it's a change of state we want to really avoid by reducing the amount of sedimentation that flows into our coastal waterways, to our rivers and coastal areas as much as possible. Coastal development, seawalls. As we develop on the coastline, we tend to put in hard physical structures, hard buildings, asphalt roads, etc. And coastlines are really dynamic areas. They need to be able to move. They need room to be able to move, just like river mouths. River mouths are meant to move over time. So we need to give them space to do that. And when we don't give them space to do that, when we put in hard infrastructure, then we start experiencing erosion problems. When the coastline tries to move, it's got nowhere to move to, and it starts undermining our coastal infrastructure, which becomes a problem for us. So we then tend to try and build concrete seawalls to keep the sea out, but that in itself is a very expensive remedy, and it's also been shown to cost a lot of money to maintain, and the effectiveness is is often not that good in the long term, because being a hard surface, they tend to eventually break down under this constant pounding by the ocean. Here we have pollution, solid waste pollution entering our system. Plastic waste is a big issue these days. Unsustainable fishing, another anthropogenic cause of damage to our coastal ecosystems. And also the use of destructive fishing methods like dynamite and maybe scuba diving at night and so forth. Invasive species is another one. A good example here, the crown of thorns that comes in and eats coral, and we often have outbreaks when the health of corals are not very high, and these species can do a lot of damage. We also have emerging issues like deep sea mining, which a lot of governments in the Pacific Island region are eager to explore because of the potential, wealth that is associated with this kind of mining. But at the same time, we know that these deep sea areas, we're also learning more and more about them, and we're also learning that a lot of them actually support levels of biodiversity, and that mining will be extremely destructive in these areas, primarily because it generates a lot of dust and stirring up of the sediment that's on the seabed. Those are some of the threats. There are some notes which accompany these slides as well, which you'll find in the package, and I think there's some more threats that are unpacked